Değerli katılımcılarımız, Ankon Plus buluşmalarının bugünkü toplantısına hoş geldiniz. Yoksulluk ve sivil toplum temasında 4 seridir sürdürdüğümüz toplantılarımızda bugün Londra ve Dublin'den konuklarımızla bireysel bağışçılık ve hayırseverlik üzerinde konuşacağız. Ankon Plus toplantılarımızı 15 Temmuz'da kısa bir ara vereceğiz, bir haftalık, ve 22 Temmuz'da kırsal yoksulluk ile devam edeceğiz. Bunu kısaca belirtmiş olmak istiyorum. Toplantı dilimiz İngilizce olacağı için bu andan itibaren İngilizceye geçiyoruz. Hepinize tekrar hoş geldiniz diyorum. Hello, thank you for joining us today. I'm glad to welcome you all to this meeting organized by Ankon Consulting. I would like to welcome our guests today, Ms. Seçil Müderrisoğlu and Mr. Cian Murphy from NFpSynergy. Without a further ado, I would like to pass to Seçil Hanım. Seçil Hanım, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, hello, welcome everyone, and thank you, Işıl Hanım, for opening today's meeting. And we would like to thank Ankon Consulting for creating such a refreshing and inclusive platform, really, and really looking forward to start the conversation around individual giving and trust in charities, both around the world and in Turkey. So firstly, maybe I should give a brief introduction about myself, my colleague Cian, and the organization we work for, nfpSynergy. So yeah, my name is Seçil. I'm a senior researcher at nfpSynergy, and I work on all our public audience-related research, including with some under-researched communities such as ethnic minorities and LGBTQI+ population. And my work is focused around public's attitudes towards charity brands. Cian Murphy, who is on the line today, who's a speaker today as well, is our director at nfpSynergy. He is really a pro in all our research, but he is also the technical lead on all our segmentation projects and other in-depth statistical analysis work. A little bit about nfpSynergy. We are a research consultancy, and we aim to provide ideas, insights, and information to all charities and non-for-profits. We have a decade of experience working closely and exclusively with charities in the UK and in Ireland. We help them develop evidence-based strategies, and we continuously work to benefit the wider sector as well by distributing regular free reports, presentations, and research on the issues that charities face on a daily basis. Today, we are going to, we're bringing you insight from a research that we have published last year. This research is called Fundraising Around the World, and it is a multinational research that explores some of the commonalities and differences in public attitudes to fundraising and giving and charities around the globe. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over the virtual microphone to my colleague Cian Murphy to talk us through some of the interesting findings from this research. We will discuss some likely points of comparisons, such as religion as a driver of trust, attitudes towards various fundraising methods around the world. And I'll close the section on our research with some examples from Turkey. And I'll see if Professor Ali Charkol is on the line with us at the end. We know that he would like to join, but he had a prearranged appointment. So we'll see if he's on the line. It'll be lovely to hear from him, a bit of an insight about perspectives on charities, about fundraising and individual giving in Turkey. And following his contributions, I'll open the platform for a question and answer session. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat below as well. If you prefer Turkish, that's also perfectly fine, and I'll be happy to reformulate them. And yeah, we hope to keep it to an hour and a bit more than an hour maybe. So without further ado, I'll give the platform to Cian.
Great, thank you very much, Seçil, and thanks to Ankon as well for giving the opportunity for us to present some of our research. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Yes, and apologies as well that, of course, this has to be in English. So if I am speaking too quickly or unclearly, or if my Irish accent is being too difficult to understand, please do shout or put something in the chat, and I'll try and slow down or repeat what I've said. Yeah, so as Seçil mentioned, we are a market research agency. We do research solely with charities and non-profits, mostly in the UK and Ireland. But we've also done a number of international projects. Over the years, we've worked with children and family across borders, looking at adoption across countries. We've worked with UNHCR on attitudes towards refugees in a number of different countries as well. But today I'm going to talk to you about attitudes towards fundraising. And as Seçil said, we haven't done this research in Turkey. It's certainly possible that we could do so in the future if there was interest, and I suppose in particular if there was a funder out there. But hopefully it should provide some insight on the kinds of different attitudes towards charities and different models of trust and warmth towards fundraising that we can see in the different countries in which we have done the research. So let me see. Yeah. So the research was carried out in 9 different countries in 2018. Now, as you can see from the list here, there is a bias. These are rich European countries or English-speaking countries for the most part. So we have Australia, Canada, Germany, Ireland, Netherlands, New Zealand, UK and the US, and the exception is South Korea, which is nevertheless a very wealthy, developed country. But we have contacts in all of these countries effectively who have been interested in funding the research and interested in finding out more about the model of fundraising and warmth towards charities in these countries. And that's the reason why we've chosen those 9 countries, but we're certainly open to repeating it in the future. We think there's every opportunity to do it in an awful lot more countries. The areas covered by the research in particular, people's favorite causes, so what kinds of charities do people prefer to support? Relative trust in organizations. How do charities compare in terms of how people trust them compared to how much they trust other institutions such as government, police, companies, and so forth? Different views on how charities are important to society or unimportant. Views on fundraising, whether people are comfortable with being asked for money by charities, whether they enjoy donating, whether they feel this is something that is important to them, how much people donate relative to their own local currency and so forth, whether they have given in the last 3 months, and some demographics as well. And we'll be exploring that. Particularly as Seçil mentioned, I think religion is an interesting factor. Yeah, and that is one of the ones that we cover. So I'll just go straight into it. And the first area is trust in public bodies and organizations. And trust is something that really, of course, it's hugely important for charities, and it's potentially a large barrier to donation, is that if there's low levels of trust in society, if there's people don't trust one another, and in particular, if they don't trust organizations that are out there claiming to be doing good, then it's very difficult to get fundraising off the ground. It's very difficult to get started doing it if nobody trusts each other or trusts NGOs. First, by way of introduction, I suppose, government tends to be very poorly trusted in almost all of these countries that we tested. So the question we asked was, please indicate how much trust you have in each of the following bodies. We asked it for a number of different bodies, and this is looking at people who said they trusted these institutions a great deal or quite a lot. So fewer than a quarter of people in the UK, in Germany, in Australia, trust their government. And there was only 2 countries where it was 40%, and that was New Zealand and Ireland. Sharing, I suppose, being 2 quite small, wealthy countries who had recently had new governments. So in other words, trust in government is something that is unusual. It's not a given, and it's not something to be expected. I think Seçil flagged up some research to me before, I think by Professor Çakulu, which stated that general trust in Turkey, trusting other people in general, is at around 10%. So societal levels of trust, thinking that most people can be trusted, is quite low in Turkey. And this needs to be thought of at the start as a severe potential barrier to developing fundraising and developing, I suppose, a thriving and independent NGO, CSO kind of sector. Thinking about charities then, though, in particular, this is a bit of a hard to read slide, so I'll just talk you through it. What we're looking at here is the rank of how trusted each of these institutions are in each of these countries. So hopefully you can see my mouse, but at the top here, one, that means the most trusted institution is the US. In the US, it's the armed forces. In Canada, it's schools. In New Zealand, it's police, and so on. And what you can see is some institutions tend to be very trusted in any given country. So the armed forces is in the top 3 in every country except Germany and South Korea. Schools are in the top 3 in every country. The police as well, likewise, in the top 3 in every country. So these institutions are trusted pretty well everywhere that we tracked this. On the other hand, some organizations are very poorly, or some institutions are very poorly trusted regardless of where we ask the question. So political parties, for example, maybe that doesn't come as a surprise, but nobody trusts political parties anywhere that we did this research. In 10th place in all of these places, and in South Korea, they managed to come below none of these, so they aren't even on the list. By way of contrast, charities are a lot more volatile. So if we look here, they tend to be pretty well trusted in the UK and in Australia, pretty poorly trusted in Netherlands and South Korea. We also know that within a given country, it's quite volatile over time. So charities in Ireland, for example, at the start of the last decade, so 2011, had very, very high levels of trust, pretty well universal. There were a number of controversies and scandals throughout the last decade that really collapsed trust in charities, you know, in a way that you don't necessarily see with other institutions. So in other words, individual stories can affect the whole sector when it comes to NGOs and charities in a way that isn't necessarily the case with other kinds of institutions. So worth bearing that in mind. If we look then at the actual scores and just looking at it in order, you can see what I'm talking about in terms of the range that we're looking at. So in the USA, people are very trusting of charities. 56% of people trust charities, down to 26% in South Korea. And what you can see is there's an interesting kind of a geographical pattern almost going on. So the USA and Canada are very close, Australia and New Zealand very close, UK and Ireland, Germany and the Netherlands, and then we don't have a partner for South Korea, but you can see that trust almost follows this kind of regional pattern. And broadly speaking, it's those areas that have a less well-developed NGO sector tend to have lower levels of trust as well. So Germany and South Korea would probably have the 2 most poorly developed NGO networks of the ones that we're looking at here. The Netherlands is a bit of an odd case. It has had its own controversies and everything else. But broadly speaking, the bigger a charity sector, the more trusted it is. And that's probably going the other way around, that the more trusted a charity sector is, the more opportunities it has to grow and for individual charities to develop as well. So that's just by way of introduction and saying that, you know, trust in NGOs and charities as an institution is a prerequisite for developing in any sort of significant sense. If we look at people's attitudes in a bit more depth then and try and understand what's causing some of these differences between the different countries, the first thing to note is this is a measure of enthusiasm about giving, how much people really enjoy giving. So it's agreement with the statement, I wish I could give to all the charities that ask me, or with the statement, donating makes me feel good. You can see quite a lot of variation here as well, and perhaps it's a variation in national character as well. Maybe Americans are just more enthusiastic than people in other countries. But 79% of Americans say that donating makes me feel good. By comparison, that's only around 47%, 50% in Northern Europe, in Germany and the Netherlands. And I think that's another important thing that charities can learn from when they are trying to develop fundraising in a country. So you need to make people feel good. You need to make people feel that they enjoy giving, that it's not just a duty, something they're doing because this is the right thing to do, other people do it, therefore I should do it. But actually it's something that makes me feel good, and you know, I don't regret having done it. It is an enjoyable way to spend money. And I think American charities are very good at doing that in a way that actually UK charities could learn from, and I'm sure charities in other countries as well could also learn from. Really interesting set of statements here. So in the blue bar, we have charities are ethical and honest, and in the pink bar, we have charities play a vital role in society. Now, often these actually go together. So if you look in the USA, most people say that charities play a vital role, and most people also say that charities are ethical and honest. So in other words, charities are important and I can trust them. In South Korea and in Germany, people think charities are less important. So there's fewer people saying they play a vital role, and also fewer people trust them. So that kind of makes sense as well. I don't trust charities, but they're not that important, so it doesn't matter. What's interesting is where you have something of a dynamic tension. So if you look at Ireland, for example, there's huge agreement that charities play a vital role in society. There's very little agreement that charities are ethical and honest. And that's due to a number of scandals and controversies. I don't want to go into them in the Irish charity sector over the last decade. But the net result of it is that this doesn't seem to be a very stable situation. Most likely what's going to happen is people are going to give up on charities and stop thinking they're important, or they're going to have to find a way to trust charities again. And so it just flags up again the importance of trust, being seen to be honest, being seen to be trustworthy for developing as an organization. And you know, it's a difficult one, because if you're trying to get a fundraising sector going in a country, it's very easy if you can start from the point of saying that charities are important. Whereas if people don't think that to begin with, it's hard to get people excited about it as an idea. And this maybe is an area where it would be a challenge for Turkey, is convincing people that, yeah, charities do play a vital role. Is maybe the first step that you have to play, as well as the ethical and honest side of things. This is just flagging up again how controversies have really affected Ireland. If we look at charities are well run, only 29% of people in Ireland think that charities are well run. This tends to go along with how well people like charities as well. So if you like an organization, you probably think it's well run, unless you have any reason to doubt that. Most people will give it the benefit of the doubt if they trust the sector as a whole. Interestingly, 65% of people in the Netherlands say that there are too many charities. I once presented this to a group of Dutch people who work in the charity sector, and the head of fundraising at Save the Children Netherlands said to me, yeah, well, there are too many charities in Holland, and they should all merge. So I was quite nervous about it, but that was reassuring. So you find that this is quite a common viewpoint in countries where there is a more developed sector. On the other hand, in somewhere like Germany, fewer than half of people are agreeing with that statement, and that's potentially because Germans have a more expansive state, perhaps, than the UK, or especially than the USA, and therefore charities aren't seen to have an especially important role to play. There aren't too many of them, because the state is picking up a lot of what charities would be doing in Germany in any case. On the other hand, if you're in the USA, then everything is very good, because people really like charities. They do think they play a vital role in society, but they also don't think there are too many charities. So the US charity sector certainly has a lot of fans in the USA compared to other countries' sectors. And of course, the risk, if you do have a well-developed charity sector, is that eventually people do start to feel a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of fundraising that's going on, and the amount of times they're being asked to donate their money in a given month, year, or whatever it is. And you can see that here, especially in the Netherlands. So we saw that most people in the Netherlands think there are too many charities. They also feel that charity fundraising is intrusive, and more than any other country we asked, they feel that charity fundraising makes them feel uncomfortable. So this is difficult, because if you remember, in the Netherlands, there were few enough people saying that charities played a vital role in society. They also think there are too many charities, and they feel that it's intrusive and uncomfortable. So the Dutch charity sector is in a really difficult situation, where it's not particularly valued, but people think there's too much of it. On the other hand, in Germany, you remember that people didn't think the charity sector played a particularly important role in society, but it also didn't annoy them. And if we look here, very few people in Germany are made uncomfortable by charity fundraising. And so when you're starting off fundraising, trying to build a fundraising culture, I think you don't need to worry about being too intrusive to begin with. Because if people aren't being exposed to a lot of fundraising as things stand, then you're not really going to risk annoying them by doing even more of it. And if you think that the charity sector in Germany is maybe the closest to what you're looking at in Turkey in terms of how well developed it is or how far along it is, you can see that you wouldn't expect annoyance about fundraising to be a significant barrier at the moment. It's more about that developing trust, building faith, and showing the importance of what charities, NGOs can bring into the national conversation. Changing subject a little bit from just charities in general, we know that people don't just think about charities in the abstract. They like to think of particular organizations, and they also like to think of particular causes. And that varies quite a lot from country to country. I think, again, Seçil flagged up the research from Professor Çerkulu that would have been education and orphans would be some of the most popular causes in Turkey. That's maybe analogous. We don't have the exact same categories that we've asked people in other countries, maybe analogous to children, which is usually a pretty popular cause in any of the countries that we've tracked. However, usually the most popular cause is cancer. So these are organizations that provide care to people with cancer, that do research into cancer treatments and prevention and so on. And in almost every country, with one very notable exception, they are the most popular cause. In the Netherlands, especially so, but in South Korea, for some reason, not so popular at all. Not a topic that's hugely interesting. So it'll be very interesting to see where Turkey would stand out here. Again, I've just picked out a few of them. Environment and conservation tends to be a very popular cause in Northern Europe. So 25%, 22% in Germany and the Netherlands. Not so popular in Korea or the US in particular. And then overseas aid and development. I think we expected this to be higher in South Korea because there's quite a strong Christian missionary group out there who do a lot of overseas work, but actually not so much. Ireland is the strongest overseas charity country of the ones that we've looked at. And it's an interesting pattern. Overseas charities tend to be trusted in all the markets where we've done research, at least, more by religious people. So there seems to be a pretty strong connection between religion and donating to overseas issues. Now, worth saying, of course, that all of these countries are, with the exception of South Korea, would have if you're talking about religious people, you're talking about Christian people for the most part. But we have also done research with British Muslims, and that suggests as well that there is a pretty strong connection between faith and overseas giving as well. So that's seems to be a pattern. It's also a pattern in Ireland where over time we've seen it become a more secular country, less religious, and over the same time period it's gone from having a very, very strong overseas charity sector to having a much stronger domestic charity sector. So you can see these changes not just between countries, but within the same country over time. Interesting to see that happen. By the way, this is from a report called Fundraising Around the World. I'm only showing you some highlights from it because, of course, we're limited for time. But there's a full detail of all of this in the report. It's available on our website, and I'm sure we can share a link to it afterwards as well. That would have detail about many more cause areas that would be of interest as well, and that differ between country and that differ by demographics. As well, though, as just looking at differences between countries, we try to look at differences within countries, because, of course, it's no good just talking about Germany or Ireland. There are obviously groups within this who behave in different ways and have different kinds of beliefs. Again, we have a full set of demographics, but this is just looking at some particular ones we've picked out. The first thing is that regular worshippers in other words, people who feel that they're practicing their religion regularly, going to a place of worship, tend to be much more trusting. And this is a feature we found across all the 9 countries that we studied. And I'd be really interested to see if this is true in Turkey as well, whether people who attend religious services or practice their faith tend to be more trusting of public institutions. I don't know what the answer is. But you can see here there are very significant differences, and it's not just about religious institutions. You can see the armed forces are more trusted by worshippers, banks, charities in particular, even government. So, totally secular institutions somehow trusted more. Some of the potential explanation being people feel a little bit more connected if they're part of a religious community, maybe feel like they more have a stake in broader, some of these broader institutions. We don't know exactly, but it's a feature we've seen in all of the countries where we've done this study. As well as that, donors tend to be a bit more trusting. So people who give to charity tend to be those people who are more trusting of institutions in general. So obviously, unsurprisingly, you can see that high value, we've split donors here into 3 categories: low value, mid value, and high value. This is done per country, so it's not just that people in wealthier countries will have higher donation values. This is within each country. And it tends to follow a gradient. In other words, the more you give, the more likely you are to trust all of these institutions, from armed forces through even to trade unions and even political parties. And there's a really strong connection between all 3 of these things: trust in public institutions, donating to charities, and faith. So all 3 of these things tend to be connected. Religious people tend to give more, they tend to trust organizations more, and vice versa in all those different directions. Donors feel a little bit of a tension as well in their attitudes to charities. So if you look here, again, we're looking at the low, medium, and high value donors, and we're splitting it across each of these different statements here. So if we look at the bottom to start with, donating makes me feel good. Unsurprisingly, the more somebody gives, the more likely they are to agree that donating makes me feel good. That makes sense. That is why you would be giving more. They are also more likely to say, I wish I could give to all the charities that ask me. And that's interesting because, of course, these are people who are giving to many more charities than somebody in the low value donor category, yet they still feel that they wish they could give more. So there's this, it does put pressure on individuals that they feel they have to give more, feel that they could be doing more. And you can see that here. I feel overwhelmed by the number of requests. High value donors more likely to say that. So there is a tension going on that the more somebody gives, the more under pressure they feel the tension. This is probably more likely to be a concern in countries like Australia and the Netherlands, where the burden of fundraising is quite high. There's quite a lot of fundraising. People feel there's a lot of it going on. It's probably not something that's likely to be relevant in Turkey in the near future, but something to bear in mind, especially if you have a very small donor base who you rely on for raising a lot of the money for an organization or for a sector. They can feel under pressure quite quickly. So if we can tie all this together then, what is it that drives people to believe in charities and in particular to support them? Because all the evidence that we have suggests that trust in charities is really important as a driver of donating behavior. So what is it that we can make people do to trust charities? This is the result of a driver analysis. So it's a statistical technique. It's a form of regression. And effectively what it does is identifies how important agreement with each of these statements are in terms of driving trust in charities in general as an institution. The figures here are percentages. That allows you to compare them directly. So in other words, if one statement is 10 and another is 20, then the second one is twice as important as the first one. Beyond that, you don't need to worry too much about exactly what the figures mean. But the main thing to take away from this is that charities are ethical and honest, and charities are well run are the 2 most important things in driving trust. And further down the list, our charities make a real difference and charities play a vital role in society. So in other words, most people in charities in the UK, if you ask them which was more important, how you spend your money or the impact that you make, Most people in UK charities would say it's about the impact that you make. In other words, if I can make a difference and have an effect on society, then it doesn't matter how I spend the money. But most people in the UK, and most donors especially, would think it's much more important how much you spend or what you spend on different areas. So being ethical and honest and being well run come out as being much more important than actually having an impact on society. And that's the kind of message that you need to get out there. And in particular, it's going to be the biggest barrier to establishing a strong sector. And this bears out with the research that shows that trust in Turkey in general is quite low. So therefore, there is not going to be the given assumption that an organization is well run. There's not going to be the assumption that charities are ethical and honest. And so that's something you're going to have to proactively combat if you want to build a fundraising sector in Turkey. We've also done a little bit of segmentation research. Now we've used a method called latent class analysis, and what it does is it divides people into groups that are more similar to each other than they are to other groups, based on some of these statements that we've talked about. And it's a really simple segmentation. We've just pulled people into 7 different categories. So skeptics, these are people who don't trust charities, they're not interested, there's almost nothing you could do that would convince them to be interested in charities. There are the people who are trapped. They're less skeptical of charities, but they have too many other priorities at the moment. They're donating they're spending their money on other things. They're maybe under pressure financially, and so they're not going to give to charities. So the result is quite similar to skeptics for a very different reason. Then you have neutrals. These people believe in charities in general, but don't feel convinced enough about the charities that are talking to them to actually take action. Then moving slightly more into the positive side of things, you have conflicted. These are people who do trust charities, broadly speaking. They want to give to more charities, but they feel overwhelmed by the amount of fundraising asks they're being given. Then we're moving into more positive territory. You have compassionates. These are people who the main driver towards their supporting charities is empathy and their values. So they want to do good in the world. They see charities as a vehicle for doing that, and they have empathy with the beneficiaries ultimately. Then you have occasionals. These are people who do donate to charity, but don't think that much about it. So they're not especially loyal or engaged with one brand or another, but they will give when asked. Then the last group is visibles. These are people who like to give, but for quite a different reason to the compassionate. It's not so much about empathy, it's about being seen to do good. And there's, maybe that's a cynical way of looking at it, but there's also a community sort of element to it as well. We're doing good as a group, and everybody should know about that. So if we look at the breakdown of these different segments across countries, what we can see is in the USA, it's maybe no surprise that compassionate and visible are the 2 most popular segments. So the USA is the country in the world, certainly with the most well-developed and most successful charity sector, makes up a very significant proportion of their economy even. And you can see it really stands out there, and you have many fewer skeptics than you do in other countries. People believe in charity in the US, and they're willing to get involved for lots of different reasons. Jumping across to Australia, you have a bit more on that skeptical side of things, a bit more in the conflicted side of things. Similarly to the Netherlands, where we saw, there is that skepticism about the amount of fundraising that's going on, and people just not being sure that they can trust charities. Likewise in Ireland, where we've had a number of scandals, people have moved from that quite trusting territory, maybe at the start of the last decade, into the conflicted territory. On the other hand, in countries where they're just, these are countries where there is a pretty well-established view of charities. In other words, people either trust them or they don't. Everyone has a pretty strong opinion, even if that maybe has changed over the last decade. On the other hand, in somewhere like Germany or South Korea, you can see very high proportions of neutrals. These are people who haven't really made up their minds about charities. They don't feature in their life enough for them to have made a decision yet. And so there is both an opportunity and a threat, I suppose, for charities in these countries to to set people's minds and to say, okay, well, this is how you should think of us. and an opportunity to convince them that they are ethical, honest, trustworthy, and going to make a big difference in society. Finally, then, just a last note, we could speculate on what this might look like in Turkey. So this is from this TEGV report. It's not surprising to see that citizens who do not trust others and who live in a closed social circle with limited engagement in civil society activities. So in other words, trust in broader civil society is pretty low in Turkey. You know, we would expect that to translate into pretty low trust in charities in general. So we'd probably expect to see more in the doubters side of things. If you're being optimistic, you might see people more on the neutral side of things. In other words, they're not yet convinced, but they're not actively distrusting. If we were to be more negative, then you might see people in the skeptical side, people who instinctively distrust charities and are not going to be supportive of them. Probably less likely to see people in those positive groups and the the visibles and so on, but maybe some kind of compassionate element as well, people who are driven by empathy and values to commit and engage with many causes. So I'll just hand you back to Seçil then to take us through some takeaways from this.
Thank you for that, Cian. In this last section of our presentation, I'll be talking a bit about the importance of showing impact and notions that we discussed, like transparency, like accountability, as drivers of trust, not only in Turkey, but globally as well. And then I'll give you several examples from some of the biggest charities in Turkey and how they are shaping their communication strategy to build trust. So this diagram is basically showing the amount of donation made by an individual is positively correlated to agreeing with the following statements on charities being transparent, charities making an impact, and charities being accountable. So the highest correlation seems to be the one on feeling well informed about where the money goes. And this is definitely an interesting topic that we have been exploring quite a bit as well. We don't only ask this in our online surveys, but we explore it via focus groups and one-to-one interviews as well. So it looks like people are quite skeptical generally and say that they would like to know how exactly the money is spent and where the money goes. But when they are asked specifically, they don't really check those like annual reports. They don't really check those stats. They don't really check those accounts for detailed information on any charity that they've given to. And there could be a couple of reasons behind this. One is that they usually trust the specific charity that they already give to. And this is sometimes because they have a close relation to the cause. For instance, in Turkey, if you're a supporter of LÖSEV, a cancer charity, it could be because someone in your family had cancer, or if maybe someone had a positive experience with them. Or the reason could be maybe a bit more values driven. For instance, if you're supporting TEGV, it might be because you're passionate about educational equality as a cause, so to speak. So having this in mind, I've gone and looked around the World Wide Web for you to see some examples of effective messaging from big and trusted charities, as far as I know, in Turkey. So the next slide is an example from TEGV, Educational Volunteers Foundation of Turkey. So I think so they are showing some stats bubbles here. It's a really good way of demonstrating impact, showing their audience that they are making a real change. So those stats bubbles here show, for instance, how many children they have reached, the number of volunteers they have, how many different locations they have taken their services, etc. I'm sure TEGV supporters and maybe doubters would be glad to see such a clear, easy to digest way of finding out about what this charity has been up to over the past however many years. And the next example is from Darüşşafaka, another educational equality charity. So we were having some chats before this session with the team at Ancon Consulting with Fulya and Işıl Hanım, and we were discussing the lack of trust in the NGO sector in Turkey, lack of trust in charities in Turkey. And we shared like some common knowledge of some of the scandals and what we read and heard about. But then when I mentioned Darüşşafaka, they were all like, oh, no, Darüşşafaka is different. We trust Darüşşafaka. And I doubt any one of you guys would go and check Darüşşafaka's like annual report, because the trust is already there. So we already trust them. It feels like there is something with awareness. So awareness and trust comes hand in hand in these situations for sure. And lack of awareness is an issue for Turkish charities in general, because if you don't know about a charity, you won't trust the charity. And this is an issue for giving and fundraising. So this is a screen grab from their websites, communicating the impact and how they are making a difference in society through some real people and real stories. And I think this is a really effective and emotive way of building trust and empathy. Finally, an example from a newish initiative called NeedsMap.Coop in English, İhtiyac Haritasi in Turkish. It is a very dynamic and engaging initiative using information technology effectively and giving control both to the supporter and beneficiary. So the way it works is it's an interactive map. Beneficiaries can log on it and talk about their needs, and a supporter would log on it and decide on which beneficiary they're going to support, let's say. And it strikes you as a transparent and effective method immediately when you see it. And I think it solves many of the problems, like where my money is exactly going sort of problems. But then I can see some criticism points for this kind of a fundraising method, especially because it kind of encourages the notion of that giving to individuals in an irregular kind of a fashion, rather than giving to NGOs, giving to civil society organizations who are more likely to make a societal change that we crave for in Turkey. But all in all, I think this is a good starting point, and it does nurture the understanding of giving in Turkey. So I think it's not a bad idea. Finally, my final slide is on some actionable insights from our report that we just discussed. There are 4 actionable insights from this report. One is convincing people that charities are well run, ethical and honest. These things appear to be precursors of trust. These things will get you engagement with charities and giving. Secondly, convincing people that charities play a vital role in society, and they do make a difference. And in TÜSEV's report, again, I think from top of my mind, maybe 4 out of 10 people in Turkey said they think charities play a vital role and they make a difference. And this is actually down from 60% levels from back in 2004, a downward trend. Obviously, it's no good being trusted if nobody thinks charities do anything useful. Thirdly, understanding how people view fundraising and number of charities. I think Cian discussed it as well. So if it's seen as intrusive, if it's seen as annoying, if people think there are too many charities, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. I doubt this would be an issue in Turkey. I feel like Turkey CSO and NGO market is still developing. So lots of potential in terms of trying new fundraising methods. And finally, analyzing the attitudes of population by the different segments and their attitudes. It will be valuable to understand what levels of, let's say, doubters in Turkey, neutrals in Turkey, and so on, just to tailor communication strategies accordingly. In the context of Turkey, we definitely need more up-to-date research in people's attitudes to giving, barriers to giving, motivations to giving, so that we can create that effective communication strategy for the entire volunteer sector in Turkey and promote that culture of giving and trust in the sector. And that was it from our part. And I'll put my moderator hat on. And I'm really happy to see Professor Ali Charkol is on the line with us. Obviously, being a semi-god academician, political scientist, he doesn't need my introduction, but just to remind ourselves, Professor Charkol is Professor of International Relations at Koç University. And with many other valuable research, he also worked on individual giving and philanthropy in Turkey report that we mentioned a couple of times in our presentation with Cian just now. I'll leave the link of this publication as well in the chat room. If anyone is interested, they can go and have a look. And we would love to hear his thoughts and insights into public attitudes towards fundraising and charities in Turkey. So if he is ready, yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Hello.
Hi.
How do I do this? Should I immediately start or?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm very glad to hear the work from Cian and Seçil. There are a number of things that are familiar to us from our earlier research, but I took 4 basic points. I want to underline 4 issues. One is that there is a difference between charity and philanthropy, obviously. And in Turkey, we basically rely on charity, and we try to build a philanthropy sector. I'm not sure whether you would agree with me, but charity has its limitations in bringing about change in any society. Philanthropy, through more institutionalized action, can actually create a lot of potential for change. And in Turkey, that's what that is missing. But what I observe over the years from our research, as well as from the literature that I'm aware of, both charity and philanthropy are very much context dependent. 6 months ago, we were living in a completely different world. And now, within the eye of the pandemic, I'm not sure whether these priorities remain the same. Most likely they are changing. We need to keep track of how these changes are taking place. Important point to also note, and Cian made this point very clearly, trust is very important in donations and giving behavior. And we know that Turkey is among the lowest trusting nations. But trust or social capital, this literature is still debating. We have the bright side of trust as well as the dark side of trust. And the dark side of trust, I mean, people talk about parochial trusts among neighborhood residents, among club members, but these are usually very exclusive networks. And the bright side of trust is you don't need to know anyone to trust them. Just the fact that they are human beings is enough for someone to trust them. We Turks, for better or worse, we don't seem to believe in this bright side of trust. We trust only people whom we know, or we think we know. Our neighbors, our city dwellers, or how do you translate the hemşeris, or but these are small, very parochial ties. But also we need to, context dependency also requires some mention of Turkey being a very divided society. Don't believe in anything you hear in the popular media about the unity of the nation or the state. Turks are very divided in terms of what they think is good for the society and what they think is bad for the society. So this image of good society is completely different from one neighborhood to another. And that's actually undermining building of trust relationships. I tend to think that, you know, diversity of opinions on what is good for society is very good. But we have to find a way of building also the bright side of social capital and individual interpersonal trust. Nordic countries maintain a very high level of sophisticated debate, which doesn't seem to impede high levels of interpersonal trust as well. So this is not an impossible task. We know it exists in many societies, but it doesn't exist in Turkey. That's the short of a long story. Last but not least, I will dwell on that in a few weeks in my talk, but there is also a big divide between formal donations in Turkey and informal donations. The informal donations are your one-to-one, I give money to you, I send a pot of soup to my needy neighbor. That's informal. Formal donations are you make a donation to LÖSEV, to TEMA, or to other known foundations and charity organizations. The fact that formal donations are Turkey are less than 1/3, if not 40%, but let's say 30 to 45% of the whole giving behavior is very telling. Why? Because people tend to make donations or tend to help people whom they know, which means a number of things. First, I'm worried that this can actually maintain status quo hierarchy rather than help people gain and maintain their social dignity when receiving the aid. So that's actually a very important point we need to think about. We need to transform giving behavior from informal one-to-one, me to you, or whoever is higher in the hierarchy making a donation to someone on the lower end of the hierarchy. We need to change that into unknown individuals making donations to an institution they trust, and that institution also needs to be accountable and transparent and institutionally follow an agenda for helping the people in need. So that's a completely different agenda than informal aid gathering of any sort. And I think it's very useful if we continue on thinking as to the benefits and the shortcomings of institutional versus individual, informal forms of giving in this country, because it keeps our potential very limited. Let me stop here. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Charkol, for your contributions. Definitely this giving to individuals is coming back in the UK as well. It's something we have been discussing in the office as well, like giving to people that we see on Facebook, or giving to like single issues promoted by single people. And definitely it kind of limits the the benefits of the sector going forward. And thank you for your valuable input. And we look forward to a session run by yourself on this platform on 29th of July, which will be back in its mother language, Turkish, for everyone. Opening the platform to a short Q&A session. I know we now approached the 1 hour exactly. I think we do have a couple of questions for Cian. So I'm going to ask him those. I'm seeing them in the chat. One from Ankon about the size of the charity sector in different countries. If we have the size of the sector or donations in terms of GDPs.
Well, the data is out there, but I don't have it to hand. So it certainly does exist. Anecdotally, I can tell you that it would run from the USA at the top. The USA, UK, Canada, Australia would be very high up, but especially the USA. On the other end of things would be Germany and South Korea would be quite low by comparison. And it's just due to different historical traditions and everything. So the data is out there. I don't have it, but it lines up pretty well with levels of trust and warmth towards charities.
Great. I think Professor Charcoal's report has more detail in terms of GDP and how much donations per GDP of Turkey, which was interesting to look at. Another question is about, I think this is about corporate partnerships in general, which is something we do look into in the UK market. But Nazlı is asking our opinion on how trust mechanisms differ for corporations, companies, when they are choosing NGOs to partner up with, like corporate partnerships, I believe. So if companies have different factors when deciding, do we have any insights on what corporations think about charities, I guess is the question.
It's interesting because most of the research we would do actually looks at it from the other direction. So if you're a charity, do you need to be careful who you choose as your corporate partner? I used to work at the British Red Cross, and one of my jobs there was informing decisions on which charities or which companies we would partner with. So, we had a rule: we wouldn't work with tobacco companies, we wouldn't work with arms dealers, or anyone that was against our principles. If you're a company, it's easier because you don't have necessarily those same principles, you don't have the same reputational risk. And actually, mostly what you're doing, or what a lot of companies are doing, is trying to improve their reputation. If you're a tobacco company, you probably work with any charity that would be willing to work with you. But more seriously then, I think increasingly, at least in the UK and Ireland, companies are trying to choose charities that will have a resonance with their staff. So they will maybe get companies, their staff will vote on who will be the charity that they're going to support this year. They'll reduce it down to a short list of 3 and say, you can choose from among these 3. Then that means their staff are more motivated by the partnership. They're more likely to want to get involved. They also tend to choose charities or NGOs where they can have a volunteering opportunity. So if they can get their staff to do something, even if it's just one day in the year, all their staff do one thing for that organization, then it can help them with staff retention. It can help them with their brand as well. They can put these things out on social media. I know of one hospice in the UK, and they had one room where patients stayed, and they kept this room aside for corporate partners to paint it, because that's what corporate partners wanted to do, was come in and paint a wall in a hospital or a hospice or something. And so they reserved this one wall just for the people who wanted to do that. It's quite cynical, but so companies do have their own set of interests. Usually what they're trying to get out of it is, staff morale, staff engagement, maybe to help their reputation if they have a risky reputation. So for example, WWF will work with a lot of companies who have a bad environmental reputation to try and get them to improve it. And that, works from both WWF's goals and also the company's goals for improving their reputation. Yeah, obviously they have a more self-interested set of factors, but that's not surprising.
Great. I think I'll take this one final question, and then if there are any more questions, please feel free to email us, and we'll do our best to answer it. This final question says, oh, there are more questions. Wait. This final question says, it appears that trust is a key factor, and trust has, oh no, more questions. Wait, don't confuse me. There was one more question from Işıl Hanım. I'll go with that. She's asking about confidence in how charities are run. Ireland looks like they're in the bottom, while US and Canada, Australia are the highest. Does this mean they have a more accountable system in place? Can we elaborate on the accountability in terms of transparency of the system in these countries?
That's interesting. If I had shown you this presentation 10 years ago, and we were doing this research in Ireland 10 years ago, trust in Irish charities was at around 82% from memory. And if you remember, all the figures I showed you, the US, the highest in the chart, was on 56%. So actually Ireland would have been an insanely positive outlier on the trust side of things 10 years ago. What's happened since then is a number of scandals, mostly to do with financial misappropriation of funds. And then the legal regulatory system in Ireland was not good enough, and it is better now. But I don't think that was the main reason. I think actually Ireland is a small country, and maybe a bit like Turkey, there's a degree of you trust people that you know, and if you know them, you trust them, and because you're much more likely to know everyone. And so therefore, when there's something that, you know, knocks that trust, so for example, somebody stealing money from an NGO, then it makes you lose faith altogether. And so I think it's more volatile. I'm not sure it's fair to say that the USA has an inherently more accountable system. I know for sure that there are people earning enormous salaries in the US, for example, that would not be considered acceptable in the UK or Ireland. But the other side of things is that it's not as simple as saying that trust drives support. In some sense, support drives trust as well. So if you have a really good charity brand that lots of people like, I think again of an Irish example, we have a religious charity called St. Vincent de Paul. Everybody in the country absolutely loves it, whether they're religious or not. And if you ask people in focus groups about St. Vincent de Paul, they will all say it's an amazing, trustworthy, honest charity. And you say, okay, how do you know that? And they go, oh, I just know it. I know it. It has to be true. I love it. And so when people love an organization or an institution, they will trust it because of that. People are not necessarily hyper-rational. So I'm not sure you can put it entirely down to a more accountable system in the US, but maybe more specific contextual events that have happened in the last decade.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of more questions, but maybe we'll get back to them on an email in the benefit of time. Thank you ever so much for all of you for attending today's session on global fundraising trends. And thank you, Ancon Plus, for hosting it. Thank you, Cian, for presenting our research. And thanks again, Professor Çakoğlu, for valuable contributions. I think there is a tradition around here that towards the end of these sessions, we do a group selfie. So I will ask everyone to turn on their videos for a moment, smile and wave. And then we'll take a selfie. Okay. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Işıl Hanım now to close it officially. Enjoy the rest of your day and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Cian. Thank you, Seçil, for sharing this valuable research with us. Before closing, I would like to also thank to our guests, all participants today, and hope to see you in our future meetings as well. Tüm konuşmacılarımıza ve katılımcılarımıza toplantımıza katıldıkları için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. 22 Temmuz'da Ankon Plus buluşmalarını kırsal yoksullukla sürdüreceğiz. 29 Temmuz'da değerli hocamız Profesör Ali Çarkoğlu'yla bu hayırseverlik ve bağışçılık konusunu Türkiye kontekstinde yeniden ele alacağız. Daha geniş bir şekilde değerlendirme fırsatı bulacağız. Seçil Hanım orada da moderatörlüğümüzü üstlenecek. Dolayısıyla bugünkü toplantıyı da bir bütün halinde Türkiye ve dünya iki ayrı perspektifi bir araya getirerek tamamlamış olmayı istiyoruz. Bütün toplantılarımızı Ankon Consulting YouTube kanalından kayıtlarına ulaşmak mümkün. Onu da hatırlatmış olayım. Hepinize tekrar teşekkür ediyorum. 22 Temmuz'da görüşmek üzere.
Teşekkür ederiz.
Teşekkürler, hoşça kalın.